The reason I came here, I speak to many, many young people, and the reason I speak to them and to you is that I would like to see you live a life, a much better life than I lived when I was young. My life was pretty miserable when I was young. And I faced death almost every day during 3.5 years. I would never want that to happen to you. I would like to see you live in a good world. Prejudice. Could you raise your hand and just, for curiosity's sake, tell me if you ever experienced prejudice?
Yes.
Well, only 2 in a class. I have a feeling that if I waited a little longer, there might be more hands up. Prejudice is a horrible thing, and it's treated very lightly in societies all over the world. Yet it leads to some very, very serious consequences, because prejudice leads people to be estranged from each other, suspicious of each other. Suspicion leads to sometimes to hate, and more often than not to murder. So it's a very serious business. I'll tell you a little bit about myself so that you get a little idea why I'm here, although I told you, but you'll get a little better picture of it. When I was 10 years old, up to the age of 10, my life was pretty normal. I was born into a loving family. I had a wonderful father and mother. The only dangers that came to me were from the outside. I remember the first year I went to school, I was 6 years old, and my walking to school, we didn't have buses taking us to school. So we walked long distances to school. And the first walk I had was going through a church. And that church had a school nearby. And all of a sudden I found myself pelted by stones. Imagine a 6-year-old little fellow suddenly finds himself pelted by stones. And I didn't know why. I knew I was Jewish, but so what? Why should they pelt stones at me? And they kept on running after me. Of course, I started running immediately away. I was smart enough not to wait for them to throw more stones at me. And they ran after me and called me by all kinds of names. They said, "You Jews, Jesus killer," all kinds of stuff. I was very upset and came back to my father and said, "What is going on? Why are they throwing stones at me?" So father said, "Don't get upset. That's the way they are taught. That's what they are taught." Then I got pretty used to it, and I knew that if I ever pass by that little street, I have to run. So the good thing that came out of it was that I became a good runner. But the real trouble came afterwards when I was 10 years old. Then it became very serious. The Nazis, does anyone know the meaning of the word Nazis? No. There was a time in Germany before World War II, quite a few years before that, when a half-crazy man, or maybe completely crazy, became leader of Germany. And he belonged to a party which they call Nationalist Social Workers' Party. And he was a great racist. And he decided that he wanted to get rid of all the people that he called were not pure of Aryan, they were not pure, they did not have pure Aryan blood. So the first thing he set upon was Jews, to annihilate, to kill all the Jews, not only in Germany, not only in Poland, but all over Europe. The second one was gays, and the third group was gypsies. And as soon as they came into our town, they made a ghetto. Outside the ghetto, no one was allowed to live except people people of the Christian religion. And all the Jews were thrown into that big area in the city with barbed wire around, and they made a ghetto. Anyone knows what a ghetto means? You know. It looks like you are very lucky people, those that don't know. But a ghetto was not the same as a ghetto here. A ghetto meant that when you wanted to go outside that ghetto, outside the barbed wire, they did not arrest you, they just killed you, they just shot you. We were also forced to wear yellow stars of David. I don't know whether you are familiar with the Star of David. It's not important, but it was in order to indicate that you were Jewish. Also, if anyone was caught without it, he was not arrested. He was shot. We were there in the ghetto for about, I cannot remember exactly, but it was about probably a few weeks. And then, after those few weeks, we had a knock on our door in the morning. We lived in an apartment house. And the soldier came in and told us to leave, to take whatever stuff we can get with us and go down to the street. And from there, we would be taken to the train. And he told us, make sure that you get, he was still a nice little fellow, that soldier. He told us, take along food because you don't know where you're going and for how long. So father and mother packed whatever food we could, put it in a sack, and we were taken down to the street. From the street, we were taken to a train station. And from this train station, we were put into cattle cars. Are you familiar with cattle cars? The cattle cars had no windows. They were completely closed. And we were on our way, and we didn't know where. We traveled about a few weeks like that in the cattle cars, not knowing where we are going. And you can imagine what the conditions were, the hygienical conditions when people are closed up in cattle cars, locked up. We only made a stop when the train conductor needed to be relieved of his shift. And when they opened the doors of the cars, and since people started dying out in the cars, they just pulled out the dead, and we were on our way again. I don't know how long that trip in the cars took, but we finally arrived to a place where there was a little town with empty houses, and they put us into those empty houses. We found out soon enough that those houses were empty because they shot each Jewish family in front or back of their houses. Father, mother, children, because we found those little graves there. So we realized immediately that they were up to no good. We thought that maybe they were sending us to do field work in the fields. But it didn't look to us anymore that they were going to send us for work. And a few days after being in those houses, they took us out from there and started marching us through the fields. And it was autumn time. Autumn time in that part of the world becomes very, very cold. So it was raining, freezing snow, and we were marched through the fields in very deep muds. And the muds were so deep that people got stuck in them and could not get out, only those that were a little stronger. And those that could not get out of the mud were shot. Also, that slowed down too much. The soldiers, who obviously were not walking with us, they went on horses. So they shot those people who were slow. It got to a point where it was getting very, very dangerous that we might all die out in those walks. And I remember my sister and I were crying that we cannot go on any longer. We were complaining to Father, and Father wanted to distract us a little bit, to help us. He said, "Oh, just a little more, and just count the telegraph poles as you go." So that helped us maybe about 2 minutes. Afterwards, we were just as tired as before, of course. And we went on. Luckily, we made it through those muds after a few weeks, I think. And there were many things happening in between, but by the time we arrived to our final destination, which was a concentration camp, most of the people died out anyway. They didn't have to kill us. We had no food. When we arrived to concentration camp, we received absolutely no food. Nothing, not even bad food. And we were pushed into a room. I'm not a good measurer, but it may have been maybe a little more than a quarter of this, something like that. And we were 50 people. We had room only to lie down on the floor. There was no room to move or much or anything like that. And you can imagine under such conditions, it doesn't take long, without food and with tremendous cold. The cold was so severe that inside the room, the walls looked like a freezer, glittering with ice inside. My father died about 2 weeks after we arrived there. And since I loved my father very much, and I was very attached to him, when I saw him dead, lying near me on the floor, I didn't want to live anymore. And so I went into a coma. My mother told me so. I did not know. Afterwards I felt it was a deep sleep. And in my dream, my father came to me with a wonderful smile on his face and said, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." Very happy face. And I started yelling in my dream, "Oh, my father is alive, father is alive." But as soon as the dream stopped, my father gave me something to eat, something to taste, and when I tasted it, I woke up. And when I woke up, obviously I saw my father dead near me with glazed eyes, and I knew that was only a dream. But after that dream, I decided that I would go on and fight for my life as much as I can, that I would try to survive. After the winter was over, and a lot of people were dead, from these 50 people, a lot of people died in our room. We managed to steal ourselves out from the camp at night. I remember I didn't have shoes anymore, so I was walking barefoot, whether it was raining or whether there was still leftover snow from the winter. And we stole ourselves. We had to steal ourselves out, as I said, from the concentration camp, and we tried to make it to the closest forests or wood or fields in order to be able to pick up whatever we found the peasants were leaving, like corn or that was not so good, or a potato, or things like that. And that's how we managed to survive. And we were there for about 3.5 years. And during that time, one student, I speak to, as I said, to many students, one student once asked me, what did you do all this time? How did you spend all these years, every day? How was your everyday life? So I jokingly answered and said, well, they didn't give us television. They didn't give us radio. Of course, television was not in existence at that time. We didn't need entertainment. All we needed was to have food. And every single moment of the day, all we could think of is, where are we going to get food to survive the next day? And I had another dream. I studied music when I was 6 years old. I started studying violin. And I was pretty good in it, much better than the math. Math was a horrible experience for me. But music came very easy, and I loved it very much. And I had this other dream, two dreams rather. I hope the day will come when I will never be hungry again, starve. And the second was I hope that I will sometimes be able to see, just to look at the violin. That didn't happen until after the war, because we were always hungry. And some people starved to death. There was a very, very long period for me to be able to recover from all that. It was not easy. And I remember when we left Soviet Russia, that's a very long story, and I cannot tell it to you, too much to tell. We had to steal ourselves through the forests to Poland. And then when we came to Poland, we were pelted with snow on the street, with snow. I wish it would be snow, with stones. Again, the same story as before, as I experienced before in my own hometown. And they kept running after us. As soon as we arrived to the train station, young kids kept running after us, and some grown-ups, and told us, hey, you Jews, too bad you're still alive. Hitler didn't do a good job on you. And so we realized we wouldn't be able to live in Poland. It was impossible. If you were a Jew and took a train, the chances were the people would throw you out of the train through the window. That was after the war. That was after the Nazi Germans left. And as a matter of fact, I had two cousins who were a very nice, wonderful Christian family was hiding them underground. And when they found out that they were freed already from the Nazis, they came out of that underground hole, but not seeing the sun for years, they were blinded. They couldn't see where they were walking. And as they were walking in that village, they were killed by civilian peasants. That gives you a little idea of the hatred that existed in those parts of the world. So we realized we had to leave Poland, and then eventually we made our way, not legally, but through the forests, into Czechoslovakia, and from Czechoslovakia to Germany. That was after the war, of course, and Germany was already divided in 4 parts at that time. It was an American part, a French part, English part, and a Russian part. We wound up on the American side. As soon as I saw an American soldier, I said to myself, well, that's the beginning of a new life. And when we arrived to Munich, a city in Germany, the United Nations put us up into they were called DP camps. And the meaning of DP meant displaced persons. So in other words, people who had no place where to go back home, or couldn't go back home, were afraid to go back home, were put into those camps until there would be some country that would let them in. You will be surprised that there were chances for Jews to be alive when they were running away from the Nazis, from the German army, and there was no country that wanted to let them in. The United States did not want to let them in. So there was one ship that came to the United States. They were sent back and they drowned in the sea. They went to Cuba. At first, Cuba did not want to let them in, but then they let in a few people. There was actually nowhere for them to go. Some of them were sent to Europe, some that paid for a ship to take them there, some small ship, and since they were not allowed they were not allowed into any country, they went back to Europe, and then were killed there in concentration camps. So that was the situation after the war. But in the DP camps, we were very happy. As a matter of fact, it felt like paradise. We were living 2 families in one room, and I was perfectly happy because there was food. I wasn't afraid I was going to be shot the next morning or the next evening. And I started going to school. I tried to catch up with whatever I lost. It was impossible to catch up. Years of study in so little time. I started studying the violin again. And it turned out that the person who I didn't even want to study anymore. I was very demoralized. I used to walk on the streets just lost. I didn't know what to do with myself. That was immediately after the war. But then when we arrived to Germany, I was not as demoralized anymore, but I just felt I didn't feel like studying. I didn't feel like doing anything. So a friend of mine heard that I was very good on the violin, and he fooled me in to the house of a violinist without letting me know where he's taking me. And finally, this violinist, who was not very friendly toward us, but couldn't help it. My friend sort of forced his hand, and he let us into his home. And my friend told him that I studied the violin once, and I want to study again. I never told him that, but he undertook it by himself to sort of push me to study the violin. And that violinist was quite a rough fellow. I found out afterwards he was a Nazi, that he was a sympathizer of Hitler. And he took his violin, handed it over to me and said, "Here, play." I didn't know how to begin. I didn't see a violin in so many years. And I haven't heard a sound of music in all these years. The only thing I heard singing. And guess what the singing was? The people in concentration camp, when they were under high fever, they were delirious. Their minds didn't really work, so they were just singing. And we knew that every time a person was singing, the next morning we woke up, he was dead. So that was the kind of music I heard. And here this professor wants me to start studying playing the violin as if I played it when I was 10. But eventually, things started coming back to my mind, and I started playing. I stopped and said, I can't go on anymore, I don't want to. And this man was very rough, sat and said, here, play. No one's going to bite you. So I tried again and played again, and finally he said, I want to see your mother. And then he saw my mother, and he said, your son lost a lot of time, he has to start the violin immediately. And so he started teaching me for free. And for those who know more about Nazi sympathizers, it was quite an unusual thing for me to see a Nazi who wants to teach me for free. We studied for a little while, and then I became severely ill. And nobody could figure out what happened, so I didn't have much time on the violin. I had to be taken to a hospital, and I became fatally ill. When I said I was mortally ill, I really experienced, as I mentioned it to another class this morning, I know how it feels to die, because I was practically dying. I was completely peaceful. I had no pain. I had absolutely no interest in anything. I just wanted to be left alone. And luckily, my mother and sister came into the hospital room and saw me in this state, and they started crying, So I said to myself, that's no good. I'm creating too much trouble for them. I have to try and see what I can do to revive myself. So I asked for a drop of water. I couldn't take in any water anymore. A drop of water, and tried to repeat it, and the water came back. My body didn't function anymore decently. But I kept on forcing myself, and it took me a long time, and I finally revived myself. The doctors couldn't do anything to me because they did not know what was wrong with me. And little by little, I survived, and then we came to the United States. In the United States, I gave an audition in a music school in New York, and to my big surprise, I couldn't believe it, they gave me a scholarship. I want you to know, they didn't give me the scholarship because of where I come from, because they didn't know where I came from. I didn't tell anything to anyone about my background until 70 years later. I didn't talk about it, I didn't want to talk about it, I didn't want to share it with anyone, and I didn't want to think about it. Finally, after 70 years, so I became a professional musician, and it was not easy for me to adjust in college when I came to the United States because I didn't know a word of English. And I can only tell you that my first grade in the United States in the college was F, because I didn't understand a word the professor was saying. My first class was psychology. So can you imagine yourself hearing psychology in Chinese? Nothing happens. So little by little I started learning English and I started adapting, but it was very difficult for me to adapt. And I'll give you a little story to see you that even physically I could not adapt to a normal life. When I came to the United States, I was invited by some relatives who lived here in the United States to spend in the evening, in the night with them. And of course, they put me I was getting into a bed. But do you know where I wound up in the morning? On the floor. I was not used to sleep in a normal bed for so many years that it just didn't feel right to me anymore to sleep in a bed. And this is just a little story for you to show you how difficult it was me. It was much more difficult to adjust sleeping in a bed than to adjust to a new surroundings, new people, kids that had a normal life. When I came out from concentration camp, I was like someone from the jungle. I didn't even know how to talk to people anymore. All that I had to fix within myself to be able to function normally and to act like a normal human being. And after I finished school, and I finished with honors, which I also couldn't believe, because I had to compete with kids who had a normal childhood and studied all their lives. I was depressed for 8 years. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't go and look for work or nothing. I just couldn't function. And then finally I met a fellow musician with whom I studied, and he used to like very much how I played. And he asked me, I met him on the street, and he asked me, what are you doing? I said, nothing. So he was a little shocked because he didn't know my background. It didn't sound natural to him. I mean, why wouldn't I play? I was a good violinist. Why don't I have a job? So he called someone up, and that was the beginning of my professional career. I started getting jobs and started living a normal life and be able to support myself. And from then on, things started looking up and up and up. I got better jobs, and I even started to enjoy life. But after 70 years, I decided that just having a normal life is not good enough for me. I should write about my experiences so that other people will know. And so I started writing about my experiences, and I couldn't get to writing. It didn't go. I started writing short stories instead, because I couldn't face looking back. Well, after several short stories, eventually I started getting back myself and looking back, and began to write down stories in my book, which I never considered will become a book, or never considered it'll be published. It was, to my big surprise, it was published, but the order of the book is very unusual, because I started it in the order that I wrote it, which was to begin first with short stories, fiction, and then some short stories, non-fiction, and then stories, and then poetry in fiction and poetry in non-fiction. However, throughout the book, I made it a point that it should serve to they were not just stories. They were stories that were based on a reality, but which I turned into fiction because I could not remember every single detail that I was writing about, just going by memory. And also I wanted to write about people in that part of the world which disappeared in front of my eyes, little towns that disappeared, and even their cemeteries were destroyed. So I felt it was my duty to at least mention the name of that little town that I remember from childhood, because we lived in a city that I had visited when I was about 4 years old. 5 years old. And so I felt that I should do service to those people who are not around anymore. And gave it the name that it had. But throughout, it reflects all my thoughts I had about religion, about God, all through my life, from childhood on. So each, whether it's a poem or story, has some reflection of my thinking throughout my life. And luckily, someone who, it's a long story, in some classes I tell it, in some I don't. Someone saw what I was writing, and he happened to be a rich man, and I didn't know, when I knew him, I didn't know he had a publishing company. And he invited me to his house. He heard some comments that I made about prejudice and about people who, let me see how I can put it. Yes, about vengeance. We were in a panel, in a group discussion, and I mentioned that in spite of all my experiences, I never felt any vengeance towards anybody. And after the war, I walked through fields. We were divided from our mother. That's also a long story. And my sister and I were walking through the fields right after the front line finished and the fighting between the Russians and the Germans stopped. I was walking through bodies of thousands and thousands of German soldiers, Nazi soldiers. And I was surprised at myself. I should have been glad, because if they would have been standing, I would be dead. But I felt sorry for them. I felt sorry for them because I knew that these were young people who were brainwashed. They had families at home. Some parents were waiting for them. Some sisters were waiting for them. Maybe sometimes children were waiting for them, a wife, or any other member family. And I felt sorry that they had to pay such a price, and they were turned out into murderers. And you could only understand it if I would have shown you pictures of what was going on, and you would not believe it. Because those people did not murder out of hate. They were murdered because they were brainwashed and told to do so. So they were following orders.
Mr. Marder, I was wondering if you want to take a couple of questions before we dismiss.
Fine.
Do you have any questions?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. I was born in a place which was at that time Romania. And before that it was Austria. And after that it became Ukraine or Russia, Soviet Russia. So it's a long story. But I want to leave you just with one message. And that message is that the reason I'm here, I play for a lot, I play for a play. I don't play. I speak to a lot of young people and do it gladly, freely, without pay, obviously. And in order to let you young people know the danger of prejudice and the fact even that some kids may be born in families that have prejudice, I ask them not to take it against their parents because they cannot help it. That's the way they were brought up. And I ask any one of you who may have some prejudices in your heart that you were brought up with, to change it into kindness, and to be kind to every human being, regardless of how they dress, how they look, how they talk, what language they talk, what religion they come from. It will make your life a much happier life, and it will make the life of those who you come in contact with much, much happier. And you will create a world around you that you will feel blessed being in. And I hope that kindness will follow you all your life, and that you will be a part of that kindness by giving it to others. And then you will not have to experience those experiences that I suffered. That's all. If you have any questions or you like to ask, yeah.
While you were in the concentration camp, were you ever separated from your mother and sister?
Where was I ever?
Yeah, were you ever separated from your mother?
Separate, yes. Yes, at one point, yes. At one point, it was even dangerous when we were driven. There was a Nazi officer standing there and was showing which direction to go, one to the right and one to the left. Those that were weak obviously were meant to be shot. Small children also. They were of no use to them because they couldn't work. So they were be put aside, and my sister knew already where she was going to be sent. So she, at the moment when the officer looked back, she ran back and joined us. And that's how she was saved. But then we were saved for other reasons. We were separated for other reasons, but not for long. The war was already ending, and we were all safe. No questions? Okay.
I have one. So let me get it right. You went in at the age of 10,
10.
and then by the time you came out, you were how old?
When I came, I was close to 14. It was 3.5 years, sort of between 3.5 and 4 years. 14 years. Yes.
How do you, like, do this? Like, tell people about your experience and just go back to that time without getting very, very depressed or sad?
No. I used to have nightmares for about 70 years after that. During the day, I didn't want to think about it, as I told you. I didn't want to hear about it. I wanted no part of this horrible background to think about. But then it came back to me during the nights. I used to have nightmares. But now, I don't get nightmares because I feel that I'm doing a very necessary thing. Talking to you, to kids like you, gives me strength because I'm doing something good. And when you grow older, you'll find out that the greatest good feeling you will ever have is when you give.